Hello, and welcome to the Merri-Cast, the show that puts you on the fast track to business confidence. My guest this week is Simon Fanshawe, OBE. He's a man of many, many talents, the founder of a business called Diversity by Design, not only an entrepreneur, but also an author, writer, and broadcaster. He's got knowledge and passion in abundance, and he's also an award-winning comedian, so he's very funny with it. So I hope you'll enjoy this episode as well as finding it informative. So Simon here discusses why passion can be your worst enemy, why he set up his business, his book called The Power of Difference, and much, much more beside. But let's start with that early career in comedy. I asked him all about that.
So, I was a comic for 10 years, but at a time at which, being a comic, I suppose, was a bit like if in the 60s and I had any musical talent, I would have gone into a band. But in the 80s, early 80s, you went into comedy. And Alexi Sale opened up that door and the Comedy Store opened up that door. So it was a way of expressing what I wanted to do. And looking back on it, what is peculiar is that I'm sort of the first openly gay stand-up. I don't say that with any kind of degree of boasting because it just happened. I didn't think about it. Julian Clary and I were it, really. So that was an interesting thing to do at that point because it meant that I had to think about who I was and what it was and so on. So what I'm trying to explain, I suppose, is that you're right. What I do is very bound up with what I am. And I think that's not unusual with entrepreneurs. I've always taken the main sort of opportunity. If something turns up, I think you do to some extent make your own luck. I grew up with advantage.
Let's take a few of those things in turn. First of all, the less relevant question is what the audience is like when you were doing that. These days, I would imagine you'd have either a sort of very sympathetic or perhaps, hopefully, indifferent sort of attitude to the fact that you were openly gay because it wouldn't matter. But what about then? What was it like then?
Well, there were two different sorts of audiences. In Britain, the so-called alternative comedy circuit was very much a resistance to what was then, the Tory government, 1979. So there was very much a sense, I think, of which is ludicrous because the jokes in the comedy and cabaret venues in Berlin didn't exactly stop Hitler. But there was an idea that somehow... there was maybe if they'd been funnier, but if there was an idea that somehow we were sort of part of a resistance, I suppose. And so it was very lefty, if you want to put it that way. So there was a lot of assumptions in there that you could rely on in that audience. What was then interesting was that in the middle of the 80s, I went to Canada. I went to Just for Laughs Comedy Festival, and a Canadian promoter who owned a bunch of clubs called Yuck Yucks, which is how Canadians laugh, yuck, yuck, yuck. And so then I ended up touring in these venues across Canada. I did a gig in a place called Moose Jaw. And this was really interesting because I then had to find a way of writing my way into what was palpable shock and surprise at the point at which I mentioned that I was gay. So that was quite interesting. And I found a way of playing off that. But I got some very good advice from a lovely club owner, an American actually called Howard Lapidus. And he taught me how to write into it. And I went to Australia too in the mid-80s. So those were really interesting experiences because they taught me about how you kind of won people around and gain their confidence before you said the thing that might have pushed them away. So if I'd just come out and gone, F you, I'm gay. Well, kind of that would have been the end of the argument. And to some extent, that's beginning to happen again. Yeah. People aren't actually doing that negotiation. And I think that was quite important for me to learn how to negotiate to be gay in public. Remember there were two shows on a Friday night and a Saturday night. And in between, I don't know who he was really. I suspect he was one of the people who worked in the club. I don't really know who he was. Anyway, there was this bloke sitting there having burger and chips in between. Horrible they were. And I wandered up to get a drink or something. And he looked at me, and he pointed at me. He said, you were that funny queer on the stage, weren't you? Now, I could have said, look, actually, I'm terribly sorry. I think queer is a microaggression. But he called me funny. He was into it. And so I think I learned a lot about that, is what I'm saying. So I think that's quite an interesting background for me. And that negotiation is quite a big part of how I do politics and how I do what I do in diversity now.
Okay, so you've said two really interesting things. Well, you said a number of interesting things, but in terms in a businessy sense, you talked about individuals, understanding what individuals want or what works for individuals, and you talked about negotiations or negotiating skills. And I am interested in sort of moving on to that as to was that a sort of fundamental part of what you thought was part of your armory in starting up your business? But I'm also interested, so it's a two-part question, about the path that you took from being a comedian to co-founding Stonewall and then the work you did locally around Brighton. And did those add to skills that then led to starting up the business? What order did things happen in?
Well, the first point, I often say to people, which sounds counterintuitive, passion is your worst enemy. And there's a terrible trend, I think, quite comes from a good, genuine place of enthusiasm. But to say to staff and colleagues, I want you to be passionate about, pizza or widgets or HR software or whatever the hell it is. And I think there's an anxiety about this. There's two anxieties I have about this. One is that actually for most people, work is work. However much they want the company to have values or take positions in the world or to be a place of integrity, all that fine. But it is still work. Now, we spend a lot of time doing it, but it is a job. And I don't know whether it's reasonable, really, in the end, to ask people to be passionate when what you're doing is a simple exchange. You've agreed a common objective, you're going to collaborate to do it, you pay them money and they crack on. So that's one thing which I think is worth thinking about. The second thing, though, is that if you are trying to convince other people, then passion actually is your worst enemy because it stops you listening. If all you're doing is telling them how much you care about what you want and feel and like and think, then you won't understand what they do. Now, if you think of that in a business context, the key thing about business, I was taught this by a wonderful friend of mine called John Miskelly, who is the most brilliant salesman in the world. He built an extraordinary IT recruitment company. John told me that he used to say, you can't sell somebody something that they don't want. So it doesn't matter how much you tell them they need it or how much you're convinced that what you've got is exactly what they want. If they don't think that, they're not going to buy it. So as every good salesperson knows, and I'm not saying that I am, but actually selling is not about talking, it is about listening. Now, I talk a lot, but I'm also a very good listener. And that's taken me some time to really adapted to business. I get incredibly frustrated before. Why don't people want this product that I've got? And I think that's very common for people in business, that we know what we've got is good, but then we forget to match it, the language or the approach or whatever to other people. So that I've really had to learn, and I'm still learning about how to listen. But I think that's absolutely fundamental to building and creating some growth in the business. The second thing is how and why did we start the business? There are two answers to that. The first is that up to 2010, I was doing some things which either directly or indirectly, the money, the income source was coming from either to the companies that I was working for or the sectors that I was working in was coming from the public sector. And I looked at the roots and thought, by the way, you don't have to be a genius to spot that Labour was going to lose that election. And you don't have to be a genius to see that was going to be the end of New Labour and there was going to be a really quite right-wing government in the sense that Cameron and Osborne were economically very dry, as we know. And so the consequences of public spending were going to be huge. So I very quickly realised that I was going to lose about 2/3 of my income. So what do you do when you are in crisis? Well, like all entrepreneurs, because you start a business. I mean, if you look at every recession, Freddie Laker back in the 70s, cheap airlines, so it goes on. Every recession does that, even if so a personal recession does it too. You just pivot, hello. So I had been involved in a housing association diversity scrutiny board. Yawn, everybody's now fallen asleep. Actually great people on it, put together by a fantastic woman called Zena Atkins, who used to be chair of Ofsted. Really, she's wonderful, Zena. She's a complete oddball. She's an eccentric leader, and I really love her. I met somebody on that scrutiny board who is now the chief executive of Oxfam. So you can see the kind of quality of people, not me, I was a minnow, but he's called Dan and Jayashree Skandaraja, Danny. And he and I started saying things that we realized we were investigating and interested in the same things. And what we were interested in is the way in which diversity was being talked about was running out of currency because people were just talking about the big identity groups And from a personal level, Danny is Sri Lankan by heritage. His parents live in Sweden, so he lived the latter part of his life. He was brought up in Australia. He's married to a woman who is Caribbean in heritage. They are both British citizens, and they have 2 kids. And we started saying, Kieran, their son, doesn't have a box to tick.
Right.
What box does Kieran tick? Other? That's a bit sad. So what does identity mean? And I've never felt inside the gay community. I've always felt one foot in, one foot out. You do that thing when you're young in the gay community, you think, yay, you go to Pride, you think, these are my people. And very soon I was going to Pride and thinking, these are my people? Dear me, can't I be on the other side of the church for a moment? So we were both grappling with what does it mean to be who we were. And what that led to was a little pamphlet we did for the Institute for Public Policy Research. And it was called You Can't Put Me in a Box. So what we were trying to find was a new approach to diversity. And so that was the intellectual backing. Then there was a personal recession. And I thought, let's start a business. So Roy and I started Diversity by Design.
Okay, so let's talk about the intellectual sort of argument behind it, because did you sort of then think, well, I've got to switch, the Labour's out, Tories are in, I'm not going to see much from the government for a while, and then the intellectual argument sort of comes along that how do I pitch this to businesses and so on. Did the message you go in with, was it well received, or did people look at you with blank faces? Did you have to adapt by listening?
Well, I think one of the really helpful things conclusions that I came to, which I continue to use a lot, and people do find it helpful, is to say that when we think about these ideas of diversity and inclusion, we need to think about them with 2 separate focuses. The question of deficits and the question of dividends from diversity. By which I mean this, is that the initial focus for this work on diversity quite rightly stems from the absolutely palpable data revealing disadvantage in the labour market and within organisations that certain groups experience. There are certain groups of people, I do this little exercise sometimes when I'm doing a conference, and I say to people, I might have done it the other day. In fact, I did do it the other day when you were at a conference where I spoke. And I'd say, turn to your neighbour and look them straight in the eye and say to them, this is as far as you are going in your career.
I did this with Charlotte, who works for me. So I turned to her and said that, and I felt really awful, sort of saying that.
Exactly. And the reason I do it is just to remind us all that that's what we're doing to groups of people. Organisations are doing that to groups of people. So there is an absolutely good reason to understand the deficits and tackle them. And by the way, when I say tackle them, I don't mean stopping at the slogans. It's all very well. You say, oh, it's racism. Oh, it's sexism. Oh, it's homophobia. Yeah, fine. That may be the context, but actually that's not going to tell you exactly what the mechanism is that's creating that disadvantage in detail, because that once you understand that, then you can start to tackle it. So the deficits are one thing. And then the other thing, which is what do you get as a business, as an organization, if you think about the markets, the products, the services, whatever it is you're involved in, if you think about what is the right combination of difference that I need in the various different teams that I've got in order to produce the outcome that I want. So, and that's a separate, but obviously related question. The minute I said that, you see, so the first bit is the box ticking in some senses, because you have to collect those big bits of data. But on the other hand, you also have to understand that when you say BAME, that is a ridiculous attempt to describe a vast group of people. So you have to really ask yourself, what are you actually describing with that acronym? Who are they and why are you grouping them together? Well, the obvious answer with BAME is that actually what you're doing is tackling racism. That is pretty much the only coherence that group's got. They experience racism. Now, there are common cultures, but there are so many common cultures, heritages, family organizations, and so on within that. You also then have to understand that when you encounter people, you can't trap them in that big acronym. You have to understand people's individual ambitions and aspirations. So one's constantly saying to people, keep 2 things in mind at once. And actually, once you get through that, oh my goodness, I mean, that feels a bit complicated, people find that very helpful.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing. I mean, in my business, in content, I'm forever taking sort of quite complicated arguments and trying to distill them down into simple things. And the AME is often, something that people are doing with the best of intentions to try and reduce something down, to clarify, to simplify. But in doing so, it leaves the thing that we talked about at the start about how do individuals feel, sort of left somewhat bereft by this kind of general description.
And also, it's not language that anybody uses. No one ever says, it's like intersectionality. No one ever says, oh, there's an intersectionality here between race, race and ethnicity and sexual orientation. What you actually say is, that woman, that Ghanaian British woman, is she a lesbian? That's what you actually say. That's how actually people talk, So there's something important, I think, about understanding that diversity is not some kind of science which has got this new language, which, by the way, has been invented by a group of people, I think, to stop everybody else understanding it. I think it's deliberately excluding, actually. I think it's about people saying, oh, I know the language, I know how to talk about this, and by the way, you don't, which makes me morally superior. So actually, one of the things we've got to do is return this whole understanding, A, to accuracy. Why am I grouping this group of people together? What coherence has that got as a tool of analysis? And secondly, what language am I then using? Because once you start using proper, plain language, you start speaking to people's individual lives and aspirations and ambitions.
You're touching on an area that you covered in the conference where you were talking about the 5 dangerous myths about diversity and inclusion. One of them was around, I think you called it blah, blah, blah. And it might have been 2 blahs, I don't know. But basically, yeah. Quite right. And I'm interested in that because I talk a lot to HR professionals and the nicest possible way, people start out, wanting to do the right thing and so on, but there's this sort of bullshit bingo that emerges around the way people talk around it. I mean, it is part of what you're doing when you go in as a business to say, relax, you don't have to hide behind these technical terms. You can actually talk frankly about issues, because there's a lot of fear out there about even discussing these issues, and exclusionary aspect to what's supposed to be inclusion.
Yes, I think there are 2 things that are fundamental about this. The first is that my starting point really kind of in life and in analysis is that the only thing that human beings have in common is that we're all different. And then what flows from that is that we can't understand how somebody else sees the world, experiences the world, and lives in the world. So the journey that is worth going on is the attempt to do so, but in the certain knowledge that you never will. And that's what lies at the heart of diversity. It's the desire to understand other people and experience and value their difference with the knowledge that you can't. So it's a fantastic, it's the human condition that we're all different. It's the human challenge to try and understand what that means. That's what it's about. If it wasn't about difference, we wouldn't need to talk about diversity and inclusion, because we would all be the same. So we wouldn't need to think about what we differently bring to the pursuit of common objectives. So that's one thing which lies absolutely. And once you start thinking about that and you start thinking, well, this is a journey of discovery, you realize. And the second point is that the journey of discovery is precisely about, and I can't bear this, making mistakes, he says, doing air quotes, or getting it wrong, he says, doing air quotes. There aren't mistakes. You don't get things wrong. What you do is every time an interaction happens with another human being, you learn about other people's sensitivities. So you build up an understanding and a way of trying to negotiate the world. But you'd be an idiot if you thought that the world could be negotiated without offense or hurt or upset, because those are the opposite of joy, agreement, and enthusiasm. So why would you ever think that you go through life without upsetting people? I mean, have these people not been in relationships? What binds you together is your love for each other, but you piss each other off, you have arguments, you get angry. That's all about being human. So what HR finds very difficult, I think, is that HR is full of rules. So it likes to have a process, and then this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to talk, and this is the right language. You can't pen us in like that. We can agree common rules about how we disagree. Don't swear at me. Don't shout at me. I can't bear the word that begins with Q that describes gay people. I find it immensely hostile. Other people don't. I find it infuriating that they use it. But the point is, that's a dialogue. I'm not going to say don't use it, but I would like them to understand the effect it has on me when they do.
Okay.
So that's what I mean. It's constantly trying to understand the difference between intention and effect.
I normally leave this question to the end, but it seems like a good moment to sort of bring it in. You've got a book out. Tell us about the book, because I'm interested in it, and not just from a what's it about kind of point of view, but also, has that helped you in terms of your business? Has it created interest from a business perspective in sort of generating leads, or just interest or awareness? Or maybe that's not your objective with the book.
It's worth thinking about our business strategy in answering that question, which is that we, when I say we, this is my friend Roy Hutchins and I, we've known each other since 1979. We were both comics. We've both gone off in various different directions. And we decided that when we started this business, that what we call our strategy value, not volume, which means that we decided that we wanted to have a significant effect on the way in which people went about diversity and inclusion. We wanted that to be more effective. We started the business from what I always describe as a combination of despondency and optimism. The despondency coming from the slow movement and the tiny movement really in diversity over the years. If you look at the data, it moves at glacial speed, So we wanted to have an impact. So our business is about trying to get to the intellectual high ground, if you like, to the influencers. So getting on the HR list of the most influential, those were the things that matter. So if that is your strategy, then that determines the route for growth. So all entrepreneurs need to make a decision about what their route to growth is and what they want to do. Because you've got your product, there are all sorts of ways of doing it. There's a lovely tailor down here called Gresham Blake. And Gresham was an art student, and he does the most fantastic suits. And I remember him saying to me once, I used to sort of run an entrepreneurial network in Brighton, which we set up called, what it was originally called the Hub 100. It's now called the MD Hub. And it's a self-supporting network of the sort of top 100 entrepreneurs in Brighton. And I remember Gresham saying to me once, his business strategy for the year was to get a page in Vogue.
Right.
That was his strategy. That was it. Because he knew once he got there, that would position the business and that would do the rest. So that's a brand-led strategy. So our strategy was all about getting, so therefore, all the way through this process, I have spent a huge amount of energy getting on platforms, getting collateral out there. So I did the report and the IPPR report, then I did something with the Good Governance Institute called Diversity, the New Prescription for the NHS. You see what we did there, you see?
Yeah, very good.
So we did. So it's all about really saying to people, here are the ideas that we need to use to transform this stuff. So the book, which is called The Power of Difference, which represents what the sort of philosophy that I've been putting forward. But the book is another part of that strategy. It's about getting prominence and profile for the ideas. It's not about me or Roy, it's about the ideas. We want people to take a transformative view of the way in which they go about diversity so that it's really more effective rather than just virtue signaling or the blah, blah, blah. So that's really what the book's about. It's an attempt to say, it's a critique of some of the current practices, and it's got ways forward and suggestions about what you therefore might do. And it's bound in, as you've noticed in the way that I talk, it's bound in with a lot of personal stories, encounters, people I've met over the years, clients we've worked with. So it's got quite a narrative to it. I really hope it's not dry. People say it's not, which is great.
No, it's not. It's really good. I mean, I might add here that, I mean, some listeners might know that I was a judge on the Business Book Awards recently. It reached the shortlist on that. So that was fantastic. I also wonder, did I hear this right? I kind of wonder whether I dreamt this or whether it's true. You're turning it into comedy at the Edinburgh Fringe. Is that right?
Yes. I haven't been at the Edinburgh Fringe doing stand-up for 30 years.
Yeah, this is sort of full circle stuff, isn't it? So
I'm going back up to 30 years. When I was there 30 years ago, I did a show at 10 o'clock at night in the Comedy Zone, at Edinburgh, the Assembly Rooms. And now I'm doing it at 2:30 in the afternoon. So you can have lunch, come to the show, have a bit of tea and get home for your nap. So that'll all be good. Yeah, I just thought it would be fun to see if we could take the ideas and make them, express them in a funny way. It's sort of my chosen mode of talking. So I'm in the process of writing it. It's good fun. I'm really enjoying it.
Brilliant. I just wonder what's next, sort of Power of Difference on Ice or something. I mean,
One of my favourite things used to come to Brighton. I don't know if it still does, but it's called it's a sort of Christmas ice show. I don't know what its overall title is, but I do remember once they did a historical sweep. So they sort of did, but they did sort of Neolithic, the Vikings, the Tudors, and then I kid you not, they did the Second World War. And I have a very sardonic godson who said to me in the interval, he was doing his GCSE histories at the moment. He said, "Oh, I can't wait for the section on the annexation of the Sudetenland." Just love. The idea is to tour it. Look, one of the things that's been interesting is the development of different comedy voices over the years. That's the big difference from 30 years ago when people were doing comedy, stand up. Whereas what's interesting now is that there's this vast range of stories that are being told in hugely different ways. Jared Carmichael, American comic, has just done an amazing special on Netflix where, well, Adam, my husband and I watched it, and Adam said at the end, "Gosh, I feel really sad for him." It's full of his personal story and his family. Bits of it are funny, but it's not really funny. It's quite melancholic. Marcus Brigstock did an amazing British comic, an amazing show about his addiction to food. Mark Steele did a show about his divorce. Comics are using comedy as a way of expressing things in the world, and they're not under the obligation to make that kind of gag. Hannah Gadsby did a whole show about how she felt trapped by the idea of stand-up comedy, although she slightly mitigated her argument by then doing 2 stand-up shows subsequent to that.
The final question I've got really is around, you were very interesting on the subject about having a significant effect on diversity and inclusion, this intellectual high ground you were talking about. So if, in 10 years' time, we were having this conversation, and we were saying, well, of course, the whole landscape has changed, and the power of difference methodology or the way of approaching things had taken firm root, and that it was so obvious that was the right thing to do, that HR had taken. Would that be, bigger than any kind of, we made $1 million, or we had this financial target, we worked with this number of companies and so on. If it had just made a difference in that sense, in terms of ideas, would that be your sort of nirvana, if you like?
There were 3 things that I would be happy about. First is if people had not a diversity strategy, but an organizational corporate strategy driven by diversity. So diversity was seen as an approach to talent, and that was articulated in a very specific way. In other words, it related diversity to the strategic objectives they had for the business or the organization, because that would be the opposite of the blah, blah, blah. So instead of diversity is the right thing to do, we believe that our customers, actually really tie that down, because that is the option for the company really to think about what this actually means. So it gets traction in the company. The second thing is that when it comes to solving the deficits in businesses, that the data is accurate, that people understand the coherence of the groups under which they're collecting that data, and they really understand the mechanism that's causing the deficit. I counted the top 300 people in the FTSE 100, and there are more white men called John, David and Andrew than there are women or people of colour who are chairs, chief finance officers and chief executives. And the margin's so huge, even if I'd made a few mistakes on the pictures that I got off the company websites, then it would still be the case. Now, the question is, why is that happening? Now, you can call it racism, you can call it sexism. Of course, that is part of the context. But actually, what really lies underneath that is what people who are doing the recruiting to those jobs value in the candidates that they think are the right candidates. And what they're valuing, particularly in FTSE companies, is previous executive experience. Instead of thinking about the combination of difference they might get around an exec table, which will help them to think about new markets, new products, new processes and governance better, they're just recruiting the same. There's no problem with the skills they're recruiting. The problem comes, they're only recruiting those skills. That becomes exclusionary. But if you just go up to the chair of whatever and say, you're a sexist, you're a racist, well, the conversation stops. Whereas if you go up to them and say, actually, what I want to do is work with you on solving this deficit, because I think you're missing out on something, because there's a combination of difference we could build on your board, around your board table. So the accuracy of the cause of the deficits would be my second point. And the third point would be that if inclusion really is about difference, then what we can't do is continue the trend at the moment, which is to say that what inclusion means is you have to talk like this, think like this, and behave like this. And if you don't, we'll exclude you. If inclusion means anything, it does mean about including all voices and understanding other people's difference and not weaponizing offense, but using those conflicts in a productive way to learn, because that is the only way that we learn about each other and we learn how to collaborate. Because in the end, we only collaborate not by what we've got in common. What we have in common in a business is the objective of the business. But the only way we achieve that objective is by understanding each other's differences and our different contributions we bring, and using that as the basis of our collaboration. So those would be my kind of three things that I would want to change.
Yeah, that's absolutely brilliant. Simon, it's been fantastic having you on our podcast. I know our listeners will love this. So Simon Fanshawe, thank you very much.
Well, thank you for asking me. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I hope you'll agree with me that that was half an hour really well spent with Simon Fanshawe, OBE. Amongst the highlights for me were things like passion being your worst enemy because it can stop you listening to the other point of view. And also that if inclusion means anything, he said, it means understanding differences and using it as the basis for collaboration. So our thanks to Simon for a brilliant interview. And thank you for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, we'd love for you to subscribe, rate and review through your podcast provider. And if you want to find out more about the Merri-Cast or our business Merriborn Media, you can find us on LinkedIn or email me at trevor.meriden@merribornmedia.co.uk. Don't forget to join us for our next episode. And until then, thanks for listening.